Hi, my name is Hugh Sasongojari. I am a research associate over at the Center of Policy Research, University at Albany State University of New York. I'm here to answer your questions. Chico gave me several questions, which I would admit that they're good questions, but unfortunately I cannot answer all of them, so I'm just going to select a few of them. I think you would benefit more from getting different perspectives from different peoples, and so to make your end project more diverse in terms of perspectives, and also it would enrich you more. So the three questions that I picked are the three topmost ones. So how the principles of free and active foreign policy can be transformed to remain relevant in the midst of a changing multipolar world order. Second part is to what extent has the free and active foreign policy has promoted Indonesia to become a middle power in multilateral forums like the G20, ASEAN, and the United Nations. And then the third question is, what are the key challenges Indonesia is facing in strengthening its diplomatic role, and how its foreign policy can be adapted to answer those challenges? So good questions again. The first question is about transformation. But before I could answer that question, I would have to start with the problem first to map it out, and then after that we could come to a solution, or at least an agreement to reach to a solution. So that first I would need to start with the second question, which is to what extent has the foreign policy has been capable to push Indonesia as a middle power in multilateral forums. So the free and active foreign policy. It has brought us closer to organizations such as the Non-Aligned Movement, BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And actually, it's around 10 countries, I forgot which, but Indonesia has joined that. And has allowed us to become relatively closer with most countries around the world. And what I would consider as maintain relations with, I would say, controversial countries, such as North Korea, Somalia, Myanmar, and even to an extent Palestine, because not all countries admit Palestine as a state, especially with the current situation going on. So it has the capability to engage with countries that other powers, such as the United States, the Western powers, would not normally engage with. It has maintained ties with them, and it has presented itself in a way that it can become an arbiter for negotiations if asked by either of these powers to bridge them in terms of reaching an objective diplomatically. But we also need to look at the other outcomes that is related to that, which is Indonesia itself has not become an arbiter for peace or even negotiations, any sort of negotiations. Countries do not go out of their way to seek Indonesia's advice for any momentous geopolitical situations. Like the South China Sea, the Taiwanese independence, and even Palestine. Now, this shows that countries are currently looking at Indonesia, thinking that it is a highly political creature, but that it is incapable of maintaining a peaceful posture, or at least a posture where it can back up its claims of becoming a peaceful power that strives to maintain the independence of all nations. Right now, it is not seen as having those capabilities. Now, if we look at other countries that are recognized as a highly influential power, no matter their size, such as at the bottom level, Switzerland, for example, or even China at the other end of the scale, they have similarities. There are some similarities that renders them a highly influential actor in the international scene. Things like a very impactful economy. Switzerland has their banking system, which other countries look up to and could be trusted to maintain their funds in cases of emergencies. And that second point there, reputation, trustworthy, it's something that is oftentimes overlooked, but is actually a critical part of international diplomacy. And the often overlooked aspect that stems from reputation is that if anything goes wrong, these countries in either parties that are parties to a negotiation, they're able to wield power in such a way that nothing gets unpunished or even gets left unturned. So that's something of a we first need to understand the concept of power in international relations. There's real power, and then there's structural power. Real power meaning the hard power and soft power that you often hear when you talk about states, international relations. There's also structural power. The things that are usually unseen are usually hidden. Like, for example, in international infrastructure, internet cables, America's guiding hand in the international monetary funds, the Bretton Woods institutions. So those things are structural power that keeps America relevant in the international stage, and it more or less keeps other countries adhering to the situation, to the environment that America has set up to benefit itself. It doesn't mean that it comes at the expense of other countries. It's just that structural power allows you to set the rules even before any negotiations take place. So that's the kind of power that we need to consider when we talk about foreign policy. So America has that. What does Indonesia have? So, and that comes into the main problem that we have. Indonesia is currently not seen as a trustworthy arbiter. It does not have the reputation yet to become that. It does not have the reputation to become a middle power that is influential, that can be, that can lead a negotiation, such as that has important international repercussions. So that's that. So there's the problem in there, that we do not have those currencies, I would say. So what's the solution to that? And to answer that question, we first need to look back at how the free and foreign policy was first initiated. It was first brought forth right after our independence by Muhammad Hatta. It came up as a solution how we could try to initiate a foreign policy that keeps us out of wars, but at the same time makes Indonesia a leading country in achieving peaceful outcomes. And that's how we got into Indonesia becoming the leading host nation in the Asia-Africa conference. That there's a whole book about that. If you could look up Revolusi, it's a book. I forgot the author's name, but I read that book, and it's amazing how that one event that we read in our elementary school history books turns out to be very monumental, and that it happened in 1955, but it more or less influenced colonies at the time in Africa and Asia to gain their independence. So we actually inspired other countries to seek their own independence. So they were inspired by us, which is great. That's what the outcome that Muhammad Hatta wanted, and that's the key part. I would say we have to separate the views of realist and liberal views. Realists would consider power to be very important in terms of trying to negotiate with other state actors in the international realm. The previous answer that I gave, real power and then structural power, those are what adherence to realist views would tend to look at in terms of state interactions. So whether you have power or you don't have power, what type of power that you have, and how you can use that power to influence other countries, that's what a realist would look at things. For a liberal, it's more or less about maintaining sovereignty, but at the same time how to work together, how to cooperate to achieve certain objectives, certain outcomes. And that's something that Muhammad Hatta was steeped in the liberal tradition, and because of that, he helped contribute to the independence of a lot of countries. That's what he wanted in the first place. It also helped Indonesia to essentially kickstart the non-aligned movement. It was not the original signatory, as far as I understand, but it eventually ended up as the first 5 founding members of the non-aligned movement. So there's that use case there. For free and active foreign policy, it was highly relevant back then. Now the question is whether it's relevant now with the current situation that we have. So to cap it all, so to summarize, the world is globalized. Peace is often the world's primary objective, but the means to achieve those peaceful outcomes don't necessarily mean inspiration to speak truth to power. It can come in the form of the economy, for example. You can economically influence other countries. That's what economic statecraft means. So there's that, changing environment that we have. And to the gist of your question, which I appreciate, how to transform the foreign policy, we first need to understand what keeps Indonesia ticking. So in terms of a realist point of view, what sort of power does Indonesia have? What sort of hard and soft power does Indonesia have? Is it strong militarily? I would argue not. even despite all of the purchases of military hardware, I would argue that it's just a means to achieve a diplomatic objective instead of a real attempt to build our military power. What about soft power? We have scholarships, the LPDP. We have cultural exchanges with South Korea. But it hasn't really garnered any benefit or significant benefit to our country. We send off domestic workers, but they send back remittances. They're not exactly impactful. So foreign labor is not really impactful in our case. So that's something that we need to nurture first. How to transform? We first need to look into what sort of power that we can nurture, how we can try to use those powers to achieve our objectives. The second part is about reputation, the liberal point of view. What countries need in order to achieve, their desired outcomes. How influential are we in terms of multilateral agreements or cooperation? Now, that's the question. How do we attempt to become influential? With Prabowo, the current president, when we look at his policies, and again, when we talk about foreign policy, we have to understand that it is just an extension of domestic policies. You cannot separate foreign policy and domestic policies. And then we look at his politics. We need to first separate his policies and his rhetoric. His rhetoric always comes, like for example, Indonesia needs to be a strong nation. It has to stand up against bullies in the international arena. And more recently, Prabowo, arriving in China or Russia, I believe it's Russia, he believes that Russia and China are non-bullies, and that Indonesia would love to partner with them. Going to Singapore, he mentioned that Indonesia wants to copy the Singapore mode of politics, but with pride. I don't know what that means, but that's the thing. Indonesia, but his words does not, his policies does not reflect his words. When we look at the policies that and the sort of moves that this administration has made, Prabowo has prioritized as more about the free lunch program, MBG. He has prioritized setting up a different state scholarship program, the Garuda schooling program. In terms of foreign policy, he appointed his own head of security for the past 10 years with no diplomatic credentials whatsoever. And he's still learning to this day. That's why they have two deputy ministers at the Foreign Affairs Ministry, because they're teaching him to do this job. Prabowo has not appointed an ambassador to the United States, to the United Nations, and I forgot how many else is there. What else is there? And even though Indonesia did join BRICS within the first month of his administration, it does not mean that Indonesia is trying to gain influence in the international arena. It does not mean that Indonesia wants to contest world power with the United States, which is primarily the structural, or I would say the hidden objective of BRICS, which is to challenge American hegemony with a combined Russia, China, and Indian power. So it's a multipolar order versus a unilateral or even a bipolar order. So in a sense, Prabowo has not really brought a clear vision of what he wants as our foreign policy. And again, I would have to exclude our military purchases from that equation. Even though we buy a lot of things from France, from Brazil, from South Korea, it does not mean that we aim to build military power, the type of power that I discussed earlier, hard power, because of course the institutional constraints remain, that the 10E is not really set up for that budget-wise. It is also structurally inept to conduct the sort of operations that would require us, would require a Dassault Rafale or even an F-15. We don't really do combined arms engagement. Our military doctrine is set up differently from conventional armies. That's an interesting topic that I could explore more further if you have any questions about that. But yeah, in a way, Prabowo has not really prioritized foreign policy yet, and so I would say he needs to focus on that as well, to help set up a foreign policy that is beneficial for Indonesia in the long run. And for all the challenges that Indonesia is facing, for example, not being taken seriously, it doesn't have enough influence in the world arena. It doesn't have, the sort of power that it needs to enact its will onto certain situations. As long as we could resolve this, as long as we could, I wouldn't say fix, but more like if we could amend the sort of structural deficiency that we have, not appointing the ambassadors, and picking the right people at the head of the job, as long as we could build power, build influence, I think that's sort of the transformation that we need in order to. We don't need to change our foreign policy stance. We don't really need to do that. Southeast Asia is unique. Most Southeast Asia countries actually do employ hedging a lot. Hedging is a strategy where you don't really side with a country much, but you try to, I wouldn't say play both sides. I would say you have to keep your foot at both sides of the field. You don't want to take sides especially in controversial issues. So that's a unique Southeast Asia perspective on foreign policy that Indonesia doesn't have to go out its way to be different. It can also leverage ASEAN in a way that if Indonesia is sort of deficient in its foreign policy, it needs to bring together first the countries in this region to get together and agree on certain objectives, certain outcomes. That way, it's definitely a way for Indonesia to, I would say, to achieve its objective as a middle power. So yeah, I hope that helps. If you have any questions, just let me know. If of course, if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out. I don't know who you are, but I would be interested in finding out more. Chico could give you my email. I don't really do WhatsApp. My apologies for that. I prefer emails. So yeah, feel free to do that. And yeah, I hope this helps. Thank you. Peace.